Sunshine in a Bottle. Written by RogueDruid. Icarus 51. Dubbed by Melberry Stars. Summary. In which the meme of Sunshine Child Izuku Midoriya is a bit more serious than anyone would have expected. Chapter 1. Sunshine Smiles. Midoriya Izuku has a quirk. Not a flashy one, not an impressive reality warping one. Its official name was simple. 2 words. Heat immunity. After all, at 4 years old, Izuku put his hands on the stovetop and wasn't burned. Amidst his mother's panic and cries, and the inevitable fussing at the hospital trip, Inko Midoriya only realized that her son was unharmed after they reached the emergency room. The doctor who ended up treating him was proud to tell his mother about his quirk, and relieved that it was something as simple as a heat-resistant quirk, if remarkably strong. The first actual test of Izuku placing his hand over a candle, green eyes reflected and catching on the gleam of fire under his palm, would linger in the boy's thoughts for years. After all, it was the first time he realized how cold most of the world was. Izuku had habits, little things. He liked the sunshine. Year after year, he constantly chose the desk in the brightest spot, in whatever classroom he was in. After school, while other students would retreat to the AC-cooled rooms and out of the heat, Izuku would find himself sprawled on the warm concrete patios and plazas, his face turned towards the sun, letting the gentle light soak into him, leaving his skin slightly darker, more tanned year by year. He liked to cook and help his mom in the kitchen, offering to pick up pans and pots, grabbing things without a care for someone as mundane as a kitchen mitt. Pans of cookies were held with bare hands, boiling water poured without a care of a scalding steam. Inko fussed, of course, worried that one day her son would be a touch too reckless and burn something valuable. But she was also happy to share her hobbies, and grew to love this side of her son, a green apron with sunflowers around his neck. Izuku also disliked the cold, not that he showed it with his uniform. One perk of his body maintaining its temperature just above the rest of his classmates. Snow melted quickly at his touch, but as he could be found wearing thin jackets and light slacks, even in the heaviest of snowstorms. He also, funnily enough, found himself facing off with his childhood friend. Katsuki Bakugo liked to prove himself after all, and Izuku Midoriya couldn't be burned. It was a interesting taunt, a metaphysical slap in the face that drove the blonde mad. After all, Midoriya never flinched from his flames. He would instead lean into them, enjoying the look on Katsuki's face when the explosions didn't make him flinch. Green eyes had just taken a golden tone and a faint ring around his pupil over the years. Another aspect of his resistance, making him immune to more than heat, to the glare of the sun, the blinding light of explosions, and the incandescent fury of fire. If someone had looked closely, had known all of these habits, they'd see the teen from an outside perspective. Perhaps they would have realized that his quirk was not all it seemed, that there was tens and conditions to Izuku's habits. Of course, those concerns were dismissed as long before anyone thought to look closer. The usual excuse arose that his quirk just meant he didn't care about things like this, that his hobbies were a way to show off his fire resistance, that boys would be boys. Izuku never mentioned to the other kids he stood in front of, which he shielded from the tantrums of his old friend, that he distracted Ka-chan with a cutesy nickname and a smile that always just a touch taunting. Izuku never considered that warm glow of satisfaction wasn't because he was being a hero. Of course, the ignorance only lasted so long. As Izuku grew, he grew more and more distractible. His mind was sharp, as if he was focused on a subject he threw through the classwork and mastered whatever was taught to him, but the moment the pressure let up that he was idle, he found himself slowly dozing off, focused on the sun. Or, if not the sun, then another source of heat. Where he once was content to sit in the sunshine and let it warm him slowly, he began to hunt. Izuku found himself drawn towards heat, towards metal slides that were burning hot in the summer sun, towards sun-warmed signs and rails that would burn to the touch, to vents and heating units that blasted hot air into the sky. The summer of his 10th birthday, Inko came home to a house filled with the scent of fresh bread and an uncomfortable heat, and Izuku sitting in the kitchen handing loaves of bread and hot pans with ease, the oven left open at his back. Of course, Inko reprimanded her son, his sheepish apologies putting the event out of her mind. If she had thought to check the thermostat, she would have been surprised. After all, despite the oven being roaring hot, the house itself was exactly her son's body temp. The summer for his 11th, however, Izuku went camping, and the first bonfire was made, tender and kindling thin sticks to thin logs stacked on an optimized airflow to burn hot and fast. The rest of the campers were happy to help, but they stood back and the fire started. They were content to sit away, only coming close enough to make s'mores, to poke the fire with sticks or add more fuel. But Izuku, shirt discarded, sat close to the flames to lick at his skin for the hot blooms across his body. Those behind him in the shadow cast were still warm, but they never realized how much cooler they were from people away from Izuku. They never realized how much the heat lessened by Izuku's presence. Izuku stayed up late that night, keeping the bonfire going, getting closer and closer. Close enough that when the camp guides woke up the next day, his shorts were black with soot and had holes seared into the hems. They astonished him for not sleeping in his bed, ignoring the way that his tan skin was streaked with ash, and that his eyes gleamed with a touch of true obsession. There were bonfires for the rest of the camp, once every one of the 7 nights spent in the forest of Japan. Izuku tended to them all, and in his chest he felt warmth take its place in his ribs. By the time he was 12, Izuku Midoriya never went anywhere without a lighter. Cheap plastic things brought in bulk from convenience stores and vending machines. Matches and flint rods with obscure fire settling tools were found in every pocket. He found 2 rusted Zippos, the metal tarnished and initials rotted. A week was spent scrounging through the parts to repair them, and sending them through the steel covers before filling them to the brim with lighter fluid. Of course, the first time he did this and sparked it up, he found that his entire hand was on fire. Turns out, splashing the lighter fluid could be dangerous, if you weren't immune to fire anyway. If you were, it was just fun. Izuku's lighters, however, were a mere symptom of Izuku's obsession. No, the true results were the bonfires. Izuku had found Dagobah Beach, 3 long kilometers of junk, of old and ruined material, of rotted couches and torn apart clothes. Fuel for the flames. An old oil drum left in the sand became a furnace. Weeks of research led to Izuku shaping the drum, adjusting the airflow, and installing vents. To make the flames hotter. To make the heat last longer. Junk was tossed in the furniture, and Izuku found himself entranced. That winter, Izuku was quiet. It was the coldest winter he could remember, and it left him lethargic, his mood plummeting with the temperature. He still refused to wear anything with a higher weight than a silk dress and a shirt to class, but he also spent most of his time leaning back against the vents to the school heating system. The halls of the classroom were always warm, just a touch above comfortable for anyone wearing extra layers. The summer of his 13th year, Izuku found himself back at the beach. For weeks leading up to the summer solstice, he was in a daze, but the sunlight lasted longer. So did his awareness. So did his obsession. And when the sun reached its peak, when the day was as long as it could be, Izuku was ready. The pile was massive. Rotted pallets left to dry were stacked in layers, left to clear the center of the pile, where an old washer was left. an old iron cooking plate bolted to the top. On top of the pallets were layers upon layers of junk, a pile nearly 5 meters tall with every spare scrap of flammable material Izuku could find. When he saw the sun begin to peek over the horizon, Izuku met its gaze with his own. Eyes of emerald, ringed with gold, stared into the sun and saw the colors that others would be blinded to. The gradient of light hidden within its blinding rings. Izuku stripped. His school shirt and his slacks were folded in one and sat on the beach with a good distance away, leaving his only fireproof shorts for modesty. His shoes and socks were folded, and his phone sat atop. He idly considered that his mother would likely kill him for this. His hair a mess. Black and green curls were pulled back, leaving his face now tanned and scattered with freckles dense enough to look like stars in the night sky. Gazing up, he looked and pulled the lighter from his pocket. By the time the sun was high overhead, the beach was on fire. A bonfire 3 times his height, but only just hotter than his own skin. As it burned, it crumbled inwards. The paint on the washing machine was melting away, and the metal deforming in its wake. The iron pallet was red hot, and Izuku's hands lifted plates and warmed metal that were barely warm. See, there was a difference between immunity or resistance and absorption. Immunity and resistance means you turn it away. Absorption means it becomes a part of you. And the doctor named his quirk wrong. And the bonfire on the summer solstice, with gleaming eyes, Izuku laughed. He was ignoring the heat of the air that should have burned his throat, the smoke that should have choked his lungs, the metal that should have seared his skin. And in that bonfire, the heat became his. Hours later, Izuku walked off the beach, the sun setting before him. His clothes were covered in ash, his skin smeared with soot and damp salt water. His phone had 6 very concerned missed calls. But under his skin, he could feel it now. The heat. He was ready. A critical temperature. Some things stay consistent. A slime villain rising from the sewers seeking a host. Izuku, 14, nearly 15, walking home, annoyed at Bakugo. But at this time, when the slime drove towards him, as it writhed as his limbs were wrapped around his mouth, Izuku didn't flinch. In fact, the hand under his mouth, he couldn't stop this sort of smile. I can't let the heat out. Just a little, just a fraction. By the time All Might arrived, Izuku was standing there, skin married by slender lines of orange-white heat that outlined the skeletal structure. His skin smoldering where there wasn't fallen ash, where the material still damp with the slime smeared and dried, the sheer proximity. As Izuku advanced on the retreating form of the slime, its limbs were still bubbling and boiling, leaving a wide berth around the circle in the ground that seamed and smoked around the teen. The asphalt itself deformed and half melted by this passing. The villain surrendered without complaint, between screams of fears and cries of pain. Minutes later, the slime now in a bottle, the acrid remains of what had boiled away left behind. Izuku smiled at his hero, his skin once more merely tanned and marked with freckles. Could I get your autograph? I want to be a hero after all. As he watched All Might leap away, Izuku glanced at the pages in his book. Good work, but perhaps keep the intimidation to a minimum. Nah. Izuku closed the book. He wasn't one for subtlety at all. He was the sunshine in the bottle, and he had the power to prove it. Now, where was that good spot to sunbathe around here? He was feeling kind of peckish. 2 years later, he hands in a correction to the quirk registry, leaning on a counter at the HBC's outer branch office. Changing the name? Izuku gave a lazy grin, eyes gleaming golden green, his hair tipped with bright embers that gleamed despite the weak light in the office. Yep, heat immunity isn't quite right. All right, what are you looking to change it to? Izuku's smile grew wider. smoke drifting slightly from his throat. His face almost too perfectly innocent, but for the faint sensation of heat rising from his lips. A friend recommended I changed it to bottled sunshine. Seems thematic enough. After all, he had captured the sunshine for years. It was only fitting that he spread it around in return.